All right, coming back online. So, so yeah, you got to see some of this stuff firsthand in the transition too, didn't you? The deadlines.
I got to see Southern Railway MS4s running. I got to see the Atlantic and Yadkin and Steam. It was good stuff. I just wish I started taking pictures about 10 years earlier.
All right, I'm gonna turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. So this program is about decapods. The origins of this was an article that I did for Line South, and I just took that and distilled it into this clinic that we're going to do tonight. So when we talk about the various roads that use Russian decapods, we're going to focus on the coastline and the seaboard and their subsidiaries. See if I can make this move on. This is probably a question I don't need to ask anybody in the room, but what is a decapod? It's a 210. And I don't think we need to, with this group, I don't think we need to elaborate on that anymore. Decapods are popular models. A couple that come to mind are the Pacific Fast Mail brass locomotives, and they appear in many layout photos in model railroaders going back for years. And I brought my own, one of my own tonight just to show it off. They are great model railroad locomotives because they can pull, they run around pulling model railroad sized trains. Another, you can get them today. Bachmann sells the Russian decapod. It's a fairly decent model. The 1618 in the background is the Bachmann model. The other two are brass. In addition to that, Penline, some of you guys remember Penline, and Broadway Limited made the Pennsylvania Railroad I-1. You can probably get those on eBay. So decapods were originally conceived to be just a little bigger than the 280, and they were conceived for the same reason, and that is to pull trains through mountainous territory. But anyhow, decapods were conceived for that reason. And interesting that the predecessors of the Lehigh Valley had the first decapod built, and they also had the first consolidation built. And they were built for exactly the same reason, to get over the mountains. Consistent with locomotive design at that time, the firebox was limited to being 42 inches wide because it fit between the drivers. And that meant that to make a larger firebox, it had to be long. And that meant that it was difficult to fire because you had to throw that coal all the way to the front of the firebox. And it still limited the steaming capacity of the locomotive. Consequently, the locomotive could not sustain maximum output. And that forced it to be restricted to slow speeds. And in addition to that, it had very heavy machinery in terms of the rods and so forth, and it was hard on the tracks. So the short answer is that the decapod had a bad reputation, and it was considered obsolete by 1916. Well, so we're talking about decapods in general. What exactly is a Russian decapod? Well, the Russians were building railroads and they needed locomotives, a lot of them. And so this is what they were using. It's a Russian Class E and it's 010. little bitty drivers, and it had all of the faults of the early decapods, in particular that narrow firebox. They didn't steam well, so they ran out of steam. They were hard to fire. They rode really rough, and they hunted. I think most everybody understands hunting, but that's when the locomotive tries to move from one side to the other, looking for a way to jump the tracks. And they hunted. And in addition to all that, because they didn't have enough boiler capacity, they had insufficient pulling power. So the Russians were not satisfied with what they had. So their answer was to design a decapod, and Alphonse Lupus was the superintendent of motor power for the Imperial Russian Railroads, and he's responsible for leading the design effort on this decapod that we're looking at here. So he put in pilot wheels that eliminated the rough riding and moderated the hunting. So now at least the railroad wasn't interested in jumping off the tracks. 10 drivers, as before, to maximize tractive effort. But then he took the boiler and he made it narrow, as long as he could to fit on the wheelbase, but he made it narrow to keep from having too much axle loading, keeping from the engine to be too heavy. And then the real secret on this was that because he raised the boiler up very high, he could build a deep and wide firebox that was mounted above the drivers. Let me give you a comparison on this. The firebox was as large as the firebox on a Seaboard Railroad M1 Class 482. So he had, the firebox is where you get the energy from a locomotive, and how you use it, everything is downhill from there. So he provided the capability to have a boiler that could steam well enough to support the design. In addition to that, it had the enclosed cab because these engines were intended to operate in Siberia, and it gets really cold out there. And a couple interesting things about this was that they didn't feel that they had the capacity in Russia to build the number of locomotives they needed. So they were going to farm it out to the United States. And it went out to the Canadians and to Baldwin and to Alco. All were assigned to build these locomotives. So Europe is all metric, so is Russia. And the engines is designed or listed here in metric measurements, but the metric measurements all come out to equivalent inches and feet. So it was made, they were designed to be built in the United States and Canada. Say again? The design was finalized in 1915. So a new design emerged, and this is the Decapod. They made 1,335 of them, that's how many were ordered at least, and 857 were actually delivered. And so on the upper photo is builder's photo, which came from Baldwin, and the one below is a photograph of actual one of these decapods in Russia. Well, that whole plan to provide locomotives for the Russian railroads, it fell apart. He did it. The Bolshevik Revolution in October 1918 canceled the Decapod order. Some sources say that only 200 of those 1,300 plus locomotives were ever paid for. And 200 of the locomotives were stranded in the United States, not shipped, and about 2 more were either just beginning construction or hadn't started yet, and those orders were canceled. But he did it. But then there's rescue. USRA, United States Railroad Administration, the first iteration of it, bought all 200 locomotives that were stranded and leased them out at $50 a day. And some railroads thought they were just wonderful. And other railroads absolutely hated them. There didn't appear to be anybody in the middle. For example, Southern Railway got 20 of them, and they unloaded them just as fast as they could. As soon as USRA control went away in 1920, they immediately returned them. The others were assigned to U.S. Army Transportation Corps with numbers starting at 1,000, going up from there. And they were converted with wide tires. There's a picture on the bottom there of the wide tires. And that's how the gauge was adjusted from 5 feet in Russia to 4 feet 8.5 inches here. About that much difference. And then, of course, on either wheel, the difference is only about that much. And some of the Russian features remained, like the Russians had these outside handrails, the full length of the boiler, and they had the enclosed cab for the Siberian winters. They had the door latch that was a wheel that turned in the center. Those things remained, but air brakes were replaced, couplers were replaced. So the engines, even though they look really weird, were operable in the United States. And it brings me to another story. And that has to do with Frisco Russian Decapod number 1632. You can find that engine today in Belton, Missouri. It was donated by the Frisco. And in order to get it to where it was donated, it was towed through Kansas City. So they got the railroad there called the Kansas City Terminal that moves traffic and interchanges traffic within Kansas City. And they towed the locomotive across town. Little problem. Nobody told them about the adjustment of the gauges by using the wide tires. And the Kansas City Terminal had self-guarding frogs. They didn't have a guardrail. They had a little raised portion on the frog to keep the wheel from going the wrong way. So every time they pulled that locomotive across the frog, it jumped all over the place. But they got it to where it needed to go. This is a list of the railroads that use the Russian Decapod. And as you can see, it's very extensive. The only steam locomotive that was more widely distributed than the Russian Decapod is the USRA Light 282. So this is another reason why the Russian Decapod is a very good model locomotive, because you can use it almost everywhere. Now, the big railroads out west didn't see them, but they were all over in the east and all over in the Midwest. The photograph on the upper right shows a Russian Decapod on the right compared to an Atlantic Coastline 460, and you can see how the Decapod's boiler is mounted as high as it is. Now, this is a total list, as far as I could take it, of railroads that use the Russian Decapod. It doesn't mean that they were all using it at the same time. A lot of these engines changed hands many times. Again, model railroaders, if you do a freelance railroad in the steam era, this is a perfect locomotive to use because they were so widely distributed. So it turned out, while the Southern Railway hated them, it turned out that they were a perfect match for a lot of railroads. The Erie Railroad, Missouri Pacific, and Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard and their subsidiaries loved them. They were perfect for the use on those railroads. In particular, they had a lot of branch lines that had light rail. And the Russian Decapods had very pulling power, tractive effort, and they could operate on these branch lines extremely well. In fact, they were more powerful than just about anything else that could be assigned to these lines. So here you have one on the Rocky Mount to Lassiter, North Carolina branch that comes out of Rocky Mount and was intended to reach Raleigh, but never got there. Here is a typical Atlantic coastline Russian. It's 8005. It went new to the coastline. It didn't have an intermediate owner, and it shows the pre-1940 lettering where Atlantic coastline is spelled out on the tender. After between 1940 and 42, they put the big Atlantic coastline logo on the tender. Also, the footboards on the pilot are a pretty clear indication that this engine was used as a heavy switcher. Charleston in Western Carolina was a subsidiary of the coastline, and they got Russians. In particular, their Russians were handed down from the coastline. Again, as dieselization came on, they recognized that these Russians were still good engines. And so they passed them off to their subsidiaries who used them until they were replaced by diesels, and oftentimes long after the parent railroad itself was diesel. This is the pedigree of the ACL and its subsidiaries and their Russian Decapods. If anybody wants this pedigree, see me afterwards and let me get your email address, and I'll send you one that you can use. But the bad news is that there are no survivors from the coastline Decapods. And the only Decapods that the coastline had were Russians. Seaboard was the second largest user of the Russian Decapod. They had 37. The Erie Railroad had 70. They were far and away the biggest, and the next largest one below them was the Frisco. And I think because of the PFM model, we're more familiar with the Frisco Decapod than the one that the Seaboard had. And they came from different sources. And so each source was slightly different, and the Seaboard classed them as D1s or D1s, D4s, and D5s. What happened to D2 and D3? We'll talk about that later. But this is the Seaboard's official diagram, and all of the classes of Russians that were used by the Seaboard and essentially everywhere else pretty much followed the same key dimensions. So this is a D1. This one went directly to the Seaboard from the USRA. It was in Durham. The Durham branch ran from Durham to Henderson, and it was one of the very last strongholds of steam operations on the Seaboard, and one of the very last engines used were Decapods. 544 is a D4, a little bit different in its appearance because of that. The cab on all the other Decapods, the original cabs extended below the running board, but these were secondhand engines obtained from the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, and the DT&I rebuilt the cabs on the engines. So the ones that Seaboard got from them and classified as D4 are just a little bit different from the others. The other thing is when the Seaboard changed their lettering diagrams on steam locomotives in general, they put their logo in front of the cab window and then the number underneath, without SALRR written next to it. They couldn't do that on the D4s because they had that little window in front of the cab window. This particular locomotive is at North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina. This is 549. It was once upon a time a Erie locomotive. It's a D5. And the smaller picture in the upper left shows what it looked like on the Erie, same locomotive. And again, we see that it's in Durham. Because of the way they reconstructed the front end with the ladder and the smoke box front, this engine looks much more American than the original appearance of the Russians. And these decapods were not limited to branch lines. They could be mainline locomotives. Here we have 503, which is a Russian, and 532, which is not a Russian, on the Savannah to Montgomery line, which at one time was a main line. And this was in October 1946. And the comment I have on there is, would you love to have been there? I certainly would have. And talked about earlier that A.I. Lippis got it right when he figured out that it was the firebox that determined the power of the locomotive, and he designed that into the decapods. So the decapods were not necessarily slow crawlers. Here you have a picture of it on Southern Railway number 11, the Savannah to Montgomery, Alabama run. And normally they used a motor car on this run. They used the 2027, which was an identical make to the famous 2028 that the Seaboard kept all the way into the Seaboard coastline years. Well, what happened was if the track was level, the motor car could outrun the decapod. But turns out that this was a hill and dale line. This was not a highly engineered line. And so when the decapod got on the train, yeah, the motor car may have outrun it on the flats, but the decapod could beat it on every hill. About 55 miles an hour. And that's pretty respectable for a 210. 51 inches, 52 inches. And with 51,000 pounds of tractive effort, these engines could pull. Again, we're going to jump over to Durham, and here we see the daily freight departing Denver, and as you can see, it's really a very long and substantial train. And again, that demonstrates that the decapod and it had plenty of tractive effort, and that's why the decapods migrated to short lines when the big roads dieselized. So we'll look at the Gainesville Midland, but turns out that this is an Alabama, Tennessee, and Northern locomotive, not a Gainesville Midland locomotive. But Gainesville Midland got their decapod secondhand. So in reality, you're really looking at Gainesville Midland number 202 here. This Gainesville Midland locomotive was formerly Seaboard 508. And this picture was taken in 1951. By 1951 and until 1959, rail fans flocked to Athens for Gainesville because Gainesville Midland was still all steam locomotives, and the primary locomotives on them, that railroad, were Decapods. So they would have been the same size as a 484, but they were big enough to be impressive. And they were steam, and they were in regular service, and they attracted rail fans like a magnet. Macon, Dublin, and Savannah was another Seaboard subsidiary. It gave the Seaboard access to the market of Macon from Savannah. And this locomotive was, again, a former Erie locomotive. Not much more I can say about it other than it was another example of a Russian being used on a secondary line. But you can be sure that the primary freights on the MD&S were pulled by engines like this one. This is page 1 of the pedigrees of all of the Seaboard and their subsidiary Russians. And again, I know that print is far too small to see, but if you want a complete pedigree of these engines, see me afterwards and I'll get one to you. And that would be the rest of the pedigrees of these of the Seaboard family Decapods, the Russians at least. So after the Russians, what happened? Baldwin Locomotive Works looked at the Russian Decapods. They had rebuilt many of them and built many of them new, and they were aware that some railroads really liked them. So they decided that there was a market for locomotives like this, and they created their own from scratch. But they used the Russian Decapod as their inspiration. This locomotive has 56-inch drivers as opposed to the 52s on the Russian. And this locomotive only generates 46,000 pounds of tractive effort compared to 51 on the Russian Decapod, but it was still a very useful locomotive that could be used on light rail lines. And they built this on their own initiative. In other words, back in those days, a lot of locomotives were built on orders where the plans were supplied by the railroads. Well, Baldwin built this engine and they advertised it in their catalog as a stock locomotive. If you want one, you could just order this locomotive and you didn't have to worry about developing all the plans yourself. And again, one reason they did it that way is because part of the market were short lines, which didn't have the staff to do locomotive development. So Georgia, Florida, and Alabama was the first user of the Baldwin Decapods. Later on, the Seaboard merged the GF&A into itself. So these engines were the first of this type that went to the Seaboard. And the Seaboard said, these are really nice. So they went ahead and ordered 8 more on their own. And just like with the Russians, as diesels began to reduce the need for steam locomotives on the Seaboard, they passed them off to their subsidiaries, and the Gainesville Midland got both the Russians and the Baldwin Decapods. This being an example, obviously, of a Gainesville Midland 203. And this was one of the original GF&A Decapods that went to the Seaboard and then ultimately went to the Gainesville Midland. Here's another one. This is in Florida. Again, I mentioned earlier that these Decapods are great model railroad size locomotives. And here's one pulling a model railroad size train. This locomotive, before it went to Gainesville Midland, was a Seaboard 524. Seaboard used them. Again, this is on the Savannah to Montgomery main line. And here you have one of the Baldwin Decapods charging along probably about 50 miles an hour, moving their hotshot freight that operated on that line. Again, this is a scene I wish I could have been there to see myself. Obviously, it was a cold day because of the amount of uncondensed steam coming out of that stack. This is a David Salter photograph. He was certainly one of the most famous railroad photographers of the late steam era in the South. This is the Seaboard's diagram for that locomotive, and really the dimensions apply to all of the Baldwin Decapods that were built. The only thing that varied is the tender. There are basically three types of tenders that were used depending on the railroad's preference. And just like the Russians, these engines could hustle. And so here you have one of the Baldwin Decapods hustling Seaboard train number 11. And just like with the Russians, it could keep up with the Doodlebug because it could run up the hills faster than the Doodlebug could. And this picture this is another David Salter shot, and it was done in 1948. Another shot in Florida. I really included this one because it's a classic Southern shot because of the pulpwood loads. Again, if you're modeling the South, get yourself a Decapod and haul some pulpwood. So on the Seaboard, this is an example of the ones that the Seaboard bought new from Baldwin. You notice the sloped side on the tender provides the engineer and the fireman a good look in reverse when they're operating in reverse, and any coal that's dumped there would slide off. Otherwise, it's very typical, and like we've seen on a lot of these Decapods before, it was found in Durham. The Russians and the Baldwin Decapods were used interchangeably. So when an engine had to go in for inspection and it was a Russian, its replacement may have been another Russian, or it may have been one of these Baldwin Decapods. Durham and Southern, there's a different tender design. Durham and Southern had 4 of these, and they're not a subsidiary of the Coastline or of the Seaboard, although later on the Seaboard Coastline bought them during the diesel era. This line ran from Durham and it crossed the Seaboard at Apex, and it joined the Atlantic Coastline at Dunn, North Carolina. And so it was an important interchange source for both the coastline and the Seaboard. Again, this locomotive is AT&N 403. Well, as I said, there were 4 of them. One of the 4 was delivered in 1932. And it was one of only 2 locomotives built by American builders for domestic use in the height of the Depression. One of 2. Here is a list of the pedigrees of the entire Baldwin production of their stock 210Os. Again, if you want one of these, see me later and I could get a copy to you. So we saw what Baldwin did after the Russians. What else happened with Decapods? Well, the success of the Russians did bring about, in some ways, a resurgence of the Decapod design. And a lot of that resurgence occurred internationally. although it occurred in the United States too, but the decapod then evolved into two distinct styles. One was the light decapod, which was typified by the Baldwin decapod or the Russian decapod, where they were designed to operate on light rail. And so I call them the light decapods. And then there are the heavy decapods that were particular for the coal hauling railroads. And they didn't care about how light the rail was. They made the fattest boilers they could make. And so they were the heavy decapods. But they're all inspired by what was put into the original Russian design. Here's light decapods. Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft, that's their Baureihe 52, that translates to class 52. 6,239 of them were built. Well, that's a class 52. There was also class 50 and class 51 and class 43 and class 44. And if you go through all classes of decapods built in Germany between about 1938 and 1944, where their production capability was simply bombed away, there were over 13,000 decapods built by the Germans. And then at that time, we became an ally of convenience of Russia, and we were supporting Russia against the Germans and through the Lend-Lease program. So we provided airplanes, we provided trains, we provided military equipment. It was all under Lend-Lease, and there was this need for locomotives. Well, what they did was they dusted off the Russian decapod design. And they modernized it a little bit, strengthened a couple of components, but essentially what we gave the Russians was Russian decapods. And 2,047 of them were built and shipped. Well, they were shipped, a couple were lost at sea, but I know 2047 were actually built. But it's a Russian decapod plan dusted off and sent to the factory. And after the war, then the Russians' railroads were devastated by the war effort. So they decided that they needed new locomotives and that they would build them themselves. So they built the Russian class L, a little fatter boiler than the Russians, but otherwise look at the relationship. Look at that high mounted boiler and that deep firebox. Well, 4,199 of them were built, and they became the main principal freight locomotive on the Soviet railroads. How about heavy decapods? Well, the one we all know is Pennsylvania's I-1SA. The first one of those was built in 1923, I think it was. They became the Pennsylvania standard freight locomotive, but Pennsylvania crews didn't like them because they ran really rough. I mean, they were hard to operate. Well, the Western Maryland and Lehigh and New England, they built what Western Maryland called their I-2. Western Maryland's I-1s were Russians, light decapods, but they built the heavy decapod. Only 14 of these were built, but no doubt at all that that's the king of all decapods. That could pull more than many articulated locomotives. It could pull more than that LS1 over there. It could pull more than a Southern Railway LS2. It could pull more than a Seaboard Airline Railroad 2664. It could pull more than a Southern Railway 2882. And it could pull more than Western Maryland's own 4664. So, and the other thing is, because it had such a big firebox, it could steam along all day long at 50 miles an hour. So that is clearly the king of all decapods. They all, well, not all of them did. The Russians had stokers, believe it or not, and these engines had stokers. You couldn't fire them with one person. So there are some decapods left around today, and this is a list of all the surviving decapods. A lot of these are Russians or Baldwin decapods. For example, the Baldwin decapods, you can find them at the Age of Steam Museum. You could find them at a Southeastern Railway Museum right here in town has one of them. And some of them are, there's one in Gainesville, so there's and one in Winder, so there's a number of them still around preserved. And then there's quite a few Russians out there that are preserved. In particular, there are several former Frisco decapods. That's because the Eagle Pitcher Mine in Oklahoma bought 6 of them and operated them well past when steam engines were used on regular railroads, and they were kind enough to allow them to be distributed to parks or to museums, and so those 5 of the 6 got preserved. There's only one that is prior to when decapods became popular, and that one has the narrow firebox, and that would be well, I have to look at my list. I don't see it right off. That's B&S 950. That's the only pre-Russian decapod in existence. And then there's one Pennsylvania I-1SA, and it's supposedly going to be cosmetically restored. Moving on to the survivors, there's our friend Seaboard 544. I had the pleasure of being part of the restoration crew on this locomotive, and it's at the North Carolina Transportation Museum. If you take Trains Magazine, you'll find a picture of it. You'll find a picture. It went away. If you take Trains Magazine, you'll find a picture of it. Issue. And then there is Great Western 90. That's one of 2 operational engines. It's on Strasburg Railroad right now. It's out of service for its 15-year inspection, but it's going to go back in service. They are taking the smoke box extension off and rebuilding the smoke box as it was originally, not quite as long as this one. But that's one of the Baldwin decapods you can see in real life. And then there is the queen of them all, the Frisco 1630. It's at Union, Illinois at the Illinois. And it's in pristine condition, operates every day. And that's it. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. I have the information. I've been trying to create a list of every Russian, and that's been extremely difficult because they change hands so often. So I have the raw data, but I can't say that I've been able to put together a comprehensive list yet. I'm working on it. As far as I know, no. And if any of you ever discover that one's been made, I want to know about it.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much. died on the other microphone. Hey, everybody, I want to thank y'all tonight for coming out. We're going to do this next month in April. Tom Gordon will be your clinician next month. He's going to be doing the little panels, how to make them and do stuff. So it's going to be really impressive. I think y'all will really enjoy that. And then also just always watch the website for new events and new clicks of things going on into the model railroad community. So there'll be lots going on. And as we promised, I'm working on the swap meet coming up in May. As Howard and them been doing everything at the train show, this is something we've been trying to get going, and I've got us a building. I'm just working on the final date to make sure everything will work out for us. So y'all drive home safely tonight. Have a good evening. Hope you had a good time. If you'll pick up any of your garbage, and definitely check around your surroundings. Make sure you have all your belongings. Did anybody leave a personal, like a leather-bound notebook last month? I did pick one up last month. So, okay. If anybody knows anybody missing one, let me know. I still have it. So, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.